morning everyone and welcome to this Tuesday Club. I'm Maura Stiles and I'm the President of the Otago Settlers Association, and if any of you aren't members, we'd love you to join and you the front desk, so that's my wee spiel. Now today we're very lucky to have Penelope Todd, who's a local author, and she's going to talk to us about a recently published book called Nell, which you can buy at the shop and you get your 20% discount if you are a member of the Otago Settlers Association. Penelope will bring the character of a paternal grandmother to life in this fictional re-imaging and digs deeper to reveal some of her own journey. And some of the book is based in the Maniototo and it's from early last century, so it'll be really interesting, probably relevant to a lot of us. Welcome Penelope.
Well, it's lovely to be here, and thank you to Mary for sorting me out. I need to lean closer, don't I? Yes. Maybe put that up a little bit. And Moira. I knew my grandmother, Nell, as a benign and generous but reserved presence when we visited their Dunedin home or when she visited us, the family of her son, in Christchurch. Our grandfather was the garrulous one who kept us children enthralled with his tales. Nell's profound deafness muted communication with her, and she died when I was only 13. If I set out to write about the past, it was in order to access Nell. We called her Bunny. To retrieve a sense of the person that she was, to see the formative elements of her life, and her subsequent approach to family and friends, to the world. Of course, the task entailed filling in her background on the international scale: 2 world wars, a depression, the slow and fast transition from horse to motorised power, from paraffin to electricity, from the pen to the telephone. And on the local scale, I wanted to learn where her family came from, whom she lived with, where she moved to and why, what her burdens were and what nourished her, where her treasures lay. Writing Nell was my attempt to find out who she was. Inevitably in the process, I learned a little more about the first 70 years of the 20th century in Otago. One of the in-laws, Dr. Francis Preston, published a family history in 1978. That's the book there, The Family of Wool Gatherers. I probably paid undue heed to my aunt's impression of the book, that it was full of inaccuracies. I suspect that that's not necessarily the case. Everybody has their own version of the family histories. Largely, I left it alone, besides which I am a writer of fiction and chose to work primarily from impressions, anecdotes, photos, and what I might call the feel of my father's family. The feel of my father's family is, or was, of reliable, thoughtful people, genially introverted and nonconformist. And at the heart of the family lay grief, or griefs, largely unspoken. My approach, or method, which I see in retrospect, was to write scenes back and forth in time. The very first I wrote was perhaps 25 years ago, the story of a stillbirth that was read on national radio. The next was written 5 years ago, another story of loss. I darted back to Nell's childhood, leaped forward to Nell in her 50s. After a while, I realised I had what someone called a necklace of cameos. I kept going. I filled the gaps. I wrote scenes for every year of Nell's life. The writing of Nell has coincided with the recent years I've spent attending to Nell's youngest children, my ageing twin aunts, who had no children of their own. As they lost their grasp on all but the simplest tasks of independent living, I did all I could to support first one, then both in staying at the old family home here in Balnow's, where they enjoyed 2 or 3 happy years back in that childhood state of constant companionship, of twinship. I have joked that this was the bargain with my grandmother Nell. I looked after her girls. She gave me her story. Around the time Nell was published, the twins' life in the old house became untenable and they went together into care. Born in 1897, Nell grew up in the Mackenzie High Country, chiefly on Halden Station, well before a part of it was swallowed by Lake Benmore in the late 1950s. Before winter set in, mother and children, horses and dogs would travel down the Waitaki Valley or over the Danzies Pass to the East Otago coast in order to spend the cold months at the smaller farm and homestead of Centrewood behind Palmerston, which passed out of the family only recently and operates now as a B&B. I'll read a short scene from 1906 when Nell would have been 9, and I'm imagining this was up at Halden Station. You'll find that certain things are expected of a young lady. Nell doesn't need her father to tell her so, although in this case he is referring to his own expectation that she stop tapping the heel plates of her new riding boots on the floor under the lunch table. Each time visitors come, she notices afresh that men and boys are lords and that women and girls look after them, except at haymaking. Then they all go out together. Everyone has a pitchfork and they toss hay with all their might for hours and hours until the children can't stop laughing and falling over. Everyone cuts their own fresh-made bread and cheese when they need it and helps themselves to tomatoes, slabs of fruitcake, apples and lemon barley water, which goes down with a cool shudder in the esophagus. Hand slapped to sternum, her brother Hamish supplies the word, and will ever after conjure that sense of gold and lingering joy. Initially schooled at home by a governess, Nell had a short stint at a convent school, then in 1911 was sent to Craighead in Timaru as one of a dozen or so inaugural pupils. A few years later she started training as a nurse in Timaru, but was called home by her mother, a not unusual story of the time. In 1924 she married my Dunedin grandfather, who had been granted a piece of land under the soldier settlement scheme at Fruitlands on the flanks of the Old Man Range towards Alexandra. And since they've enjoyed some good frosts up there this year, I thought I would just read a scene from 1925. Winter sets in early, the first frost for mid-March, a white scuff appearing on the grass in the half hour before sunrise, the chooks high-stepping over the cold mud of their run and fluffing their feathers as they ask for their morning mash. In the next month, the cabbages not yet harvested for sale freeze and split open. The kitchen garden greens have to be eaten regardless, along with the cabbages, boiled, fried with leftover potato, or roasted in slabs. The holes Herb has dug all over the hillside stand empty. It's too late, too cold now to put in the young trees. It's all on hold. The eggs and cockerels, the vegetables, the fruit business. By mid-May, the ground is set hard and the mornings are white. Grass, hills, willow branches, beneath brilliant blue sky. In June, the sun disappears behind a billow of cloud that creeps up the valley one afternoon and settles, unmoving for the next 6 weeks. Each day the frost is whiter, spikier, heavier on the fences and posts. The tussocks near the house are crystalline explosions. The willows have sprouted leaves of ice and wire barbs on the fences put forth frosted shoots. Inside the hut it's cosy as long as 3 logs or more are burning at any given moment. The sod walls are thick and hold warmth, but cold seeps through the window panes and the wooden door. It comes up through the sacks on the floor. Nell is heavy with child. She agreed when they married to leave the singer in town for occasional use there, but now she sees that that was a mistake. She keeps her small suitcase packed and hopes that Herb will relent one day and let her take the Ford away into town. But of course, the dangers increase daily, her size and the baby's imminence, the coating of frost on the road, black ice on the corners. The doctor goes about with chains permanently wrapped around his tyres, headlights probing the fog. The child, a boy, was stillborn. Another boy was born in 1927 when money from Nell's father enabled them to leave the failing enterprise at Fruitlands and to buy Glenshee Station, north of Naseby, on the edge of the Maniototo, running up to Danzy's Pass. At Glenshee, Nell had 4 more children, her third being my father. Herb was a learner farmer, Nell the one with the understanding and experience of the ebb and flow, the highs and lows of a farm's productivity and fluctuating income. Herb, Nell and the farm made it through the Depression and the Second World War, when demand for uniforms, socks and blankets for the troops sent wool prices soaring. The ensuing plummet made my grandfather nervous. I'm reading here from 1947. A shiver runs over Nell's neck as Herb comes in for lunch, the care he is taking. He bends to set his muddied boots side by side, pulls strands of hay from his jersey and drops them, twisted, onto the kindling box. He walks gingerly across to the sink to wash his hands. I have news. He stops there, twining the towel in his hands. Nell crouches to take the shepherd's pie from the coal range. The oven cloth is scorched and thinning. Fast, she drops the pie dish onto the board beside the bread, straightens and takes off her pinny. Seated now, Herb waits for her, smoothing the rattan table mat. She serves, cuts bread, passes butter, and for a while they eat in silence. I've found a buyer. Nell puts down her fork. I thought we'd agreed to wait. I can't. Coleman has to be paid, the bank and the others. We're not the only ones. It's a sinking boat and I want to be off it. Nell shakes her head, can't seem to stop. Who is it? Harry Parker. Enlarging his empire, she thinks. So what was the discussion? No discussion, it's done. We've sold. The chair flies out behind her. Nell finds herself in the middle of the kitchen. We've? No, I did not. The room is whiting out. She puts a hand to the coffee grinder handle and drops her head. Whose money bought this farm, she asks. Whose name is on the title? Herb takes another mouthful and chews it thoroughly. Army tactic. In the face of opposition, take your time. 2 questions, 2 answers. Whose money? Largely yours. Whose name? Mine. Nell steps into gumboots and drags a coat from the pile, barely aware until she finds herself at the water race 200 yards above the house. It loops about the hillsides like a pencil line on a contour map, falling half a yard every few miles. It cuts the farm into 2, above and below the race. She's too het up to follow the tamed and twinkling water. The new fence line marks the easiest route for her climb, straight towards the sky, the sou'wester at her back. Sheep run away to her left, and over the fence heifers back off. Her chest and legs hurt, but she won't slacken her pace, not until the pup Daff appears at her knee, laughing regardless and dashing ahead. Then Nell turns and looks. The farmhouse below squats square and obstinate in the remnant frost, puffing its chimney, which hardly spreads its warmth beyond the big kitchen. Herb will be wiping his plate with a crust of bread, then he'll wait. And wait, will he? For her to come and make a pot of tea, to put out fruitcake, cheese and an apple, sliced and cored. Nell's gaze roams to the right along the tops of the Ida Range, dusted with snow after the night of tearing wind, and scans left across the shades of blue that are the rolling, flattened Maniototo plains, to the Kakanuis, more than dusted, lightly coated in their march towards Mount Kyburn at her back. She turns and climbs again, to the chalk pit, she decides, and she hugs onto the fence now so as not to lose her balance on the steep slope, one finger hooked around the wire, the force of breath dragging in and out. Everything she can see as she faces north, and a third of what lies behind is theirs. Hers rightfully, but of course she paid her inheritance over to Herb so he could buy the farm for them. She never dreamed he'd... The word makes her flinch. That he'd betray her like this. And yet, why does she disbelieve? It's not the first time. The house that they lived in was one that they built, and it's made entirely of concrete slabs, which I think was quite innovative in the 1920s or late 20s when they put it up. And it was horrendously cold, I gather. Glenshee was sold in 1947, and in due course was turned by Eden Hoare into a museum for women's gowns. Nell and Herb moved down country to Centrewood to care for Nell's mother until her death 2 years later. Their oldest son, Colin Todd, was a gifted student of biochemistry at Otago University and soon to embark on his PhD on insulin development. I call him Adam in the novel. And here, in 1949, he has taken Nell up the Matukituki Valley to the aspiring hut. They arrive mid-afternoon at the new hut, huge and sturdy on its foundations of river schist. The opening the previous autumn was a grand affair, Adam tells her, attended by the who's who of the country's burgeoning alpinism, and followed by a day of lugging timber above the bushline for repairs to a wind-flattened bivouac. "Sit, Mother, and I'll make us a cuppa." Nell goes to kneel on the bench seat in the high window. The valley spreads away in the foreground. Bush-clad ridges rise steeply from it, and above them, aspiring, rears its angled horn. A telescope has been placed nearby, and she stands to train it on the peak, sheer and white, with sunless patches of blue ice. "Next year, Mother, all going well." Adam is at her elbow. Her head makes a quick, involuntary shake. "Perhaps tell me about it after the event." She takes the enamel mug of weak black tea. He's even found a slice of lemon to float in it. "You mustn't put your head in the sand about this. You must accept that I'll spend as much time as I can in the coming years up here, gaining skill on ice and snow, rock too. Some of the chaps are talking about the Himalaya." Nell blows and sips. Why does he use the imperative voice? Must, mustn't. She will do whatever helps her keep her balance. A mind that constantly casts ahead is capable of brewing up calamities. She mustn't allow imagination to add its frenzied trimmings to portent. "Tell me about it then," she says, and he points out the bush ridge, the high rocky ridge, then the blue ridge of permanent ice that will be their route. "You can come any time you want, you know. It's always a treat to have someone back in the hut with hot food and water ready when we come down." Nell shivers. Someone who will be the first to know if the climb hasn't gone well. The family's next home was a large slate-roofed house with a turret on what has become, as seen from the road and aerial views, a wilderness on Totara Street in Ravensbourne. I've got a tiny photo there of the house in case anyone recognises it, but it really is completely surrounded by trees and holly hedge and impenetrable almost. So Colin made expeditions in 1954, first with Edmund Hillary and others into Nepal, where he made the first ascent of Mount Barantse. Then he joined an Oxford University team exploring West Nepal as their climbing expert. He brought back an extraordinary slide collection of the region's fauna. He died the following year in a motorbike accident. The PhD was awarded posthumously and a hut built in his memory high on the flanks of Mount Aspiring, and some of you might know the Colin Todd hut. While living in Ravensbourne for a year or two, Herb, my grandfather, was mayor of West Harbour. Sounds like there were an awful lot of mayors back then, and they switched around pretty short order. Anyway, that suited his personality quite well, I think. He was also an avid campaigner against fluoridation of water and for clean soil. I learned that Lady Eve Balfour of the Soil Association had visited New Zealand, Dunedin, and my grandparents, and so I had fun with this scene from 1958. Charles Brash was a friend of the family. "Of course I know of you, Lady Balfour." Eve, please, Mr. Brash. Charles, then. The arrival of visitors, one planned, one spontaneous, requires Nell to cut a quick caper. Do sit. She gestures at the two fireside chairs. Charles, did you know that Lady Eve has written detective novels as well as her books and articles about the living soil? Sorry, I've lost my spot a moment. Lady Eve, Charles grew up cheek by jowl with Herb's family, but more importantly, he's also a fine writer. He corrals our nation's best literary offerings into a quarterly, is it? Magazine. Oh. Nell goes for tea and cake, the green tea set, white cane tray with gingham cloth, glad to know they'll find their way, and that she can do what she does best, listen, observe, and prompt if necessary. When she returns, Eve is saying, I'm glad I played at writing in the 20s with my friend Beryl. You know, we published our novels as Herndon Belfer, because it meant that when the time came, I brought some skill and a sense of drama to bear on my fascination with dirt. Charles laughs and Nell sinks gratefully onto the sofa. How did you come to be here? Charles asks Eve with a glance at Nell. Nell's Herb has been my most energetic New Zealand correspondent as a member of the Soil Association. When he heard I was coming south, he proposed a visit. So here I am for 2 nights and mighty grateful for the respite from travelling and giving talks. She smiles so warmly that Nell feels a blush rise. Eve has bonded with her, to use Eve's own term, and has made it apparent that she would rather poke about in the garden and local lanes with Nell than linger indoors with Herb, who was inclined to stretch meal times and tea breaks into lengthy discussions or discourses. There was a time when Nell would have felt herself disintegrating in the presence of 2 such talents, although Charles, a dozen years her junior, has never added self-importance to his influence and generosity. But hard circumstances have shown that her part, as far as she can discern it, is to walk alongside whomever life brings to her door. Her guests eat heartily and enjoy a second pot of tea with much laughter. Then Charles takes his leave, and from his bag a slim book for Nell, titled 3 Poems. Eve suggests that she and Nell go out and plant the broad beans. And if the house sale hasn't gone through by spring, you and Herb can enjoy the harvest. I want to tell you about my travels in Turkey, where I fell in love with the marvellously versatile bakla, or broad bean. Just keeping an eye on the time, I'll leave the last 15 minutes for any questions you might have. So, In 1960, Herb and the twins moved to a villa in Balnowes. Nell joined the little croquet club at the end of the street and went on to play in national tournaments. I'll do one last reading from 1967. Driving down to the city, Nell turns the VW left onto George Street and finds herself in the thick of things, slowed to a crawl. Students are marching in the opposite direction, with coats, scarves, mittens and banners. Their breath plumes amongst placards and chants pronouncing, "Troops out now! War is hell!" There's a pock on the roof above Nell's head. Egg yolk and white slide down the side window. She will assume that the sleek black car in front of her is the intended target, since broken shells litter its roof and something like tomato relish slides down the back window. A young woman dashes up and runs alongside its passenger window, smacking at the glass, and when the car speeds up, she spits after it. Herb has tried explaining to Nell the necessity for Western intervention in Vietnam, but he might as well be wrapping sticks together. Nell doesn't have to attend a war to know that it's hell, that it solves nothing and serves only to entrench the antagonists and damages and antipathies for generations, eons. At the shoemender's, she looks out of his George Street window at a group of stragglers who might be debating whether conviction will carry them on to the octagon or if they'll dash away to their next lecture. Nell asks the cobbler, as Herb still calls him, what he makes of the march. Had a young soldier bring his boots in for me to fix, I was sorely tempted to glue burrs in the toes. loosen the nails and make his training a nightmare. But of course it's not the young fella's fault. They're just following their blood. It's the politician's feet need nailing to the floor. He ducks down to look under the counter. Nell considers, are the young people out protesting not also following their blood? The man stands and presses her favourite shoes to the counter, resoled. So they are, but he consults the ceiling. They've made theirs run contrary-wise. They've given the matter some thought. The mob goes off to war, and the thinkers stay away. Nell looks at the cardboard tag and opens her purse. She's pretty sure she knows what Herb would say on the thesis of warriors versus thinkers. Of course she loathes war, and the students loathe war, but really, she, the students and the cobbler have only their aversions and opinions to offer up. The machinery of endless repetitious war is oiled and kept running by men who are welded to their ideologies and intentions. She puts a pound note on the counter. The cobbler fishes for change in his drawer. Shoes should be good as new for a few years, nicely made and nice to work with. He counts the money into Nell's hand. I was glad of this trade in the last war. They told me to stay and make boots rather than put on a pair myself. He gives her a nod, then turns back to his workbench. Tucking the shoes into her capacious bag, Nell wonders if there is something in the makeup of the human race itself that depends on the outlet and the demolitions of war, since it seems unable to imagine or desire another way through conflict. And yet, at its root, is war even about dissension or greed? Herb believes in evil, that it exists as his God exists, independent of man. Maybe he's right. It would make a kind of horrid sense that evil has roamed the earth since time began, goading and abetting men to fight, and only ever being appeased momentarily by the prodigious shedding of blood. Outside the shop, Nell repositions her hat. What a morbid train of thought she's taken. The road is steaming in the sun, and the demonstrators are singing, the last of them a block away now. 2 tea shop assistants are carrying a round table onto the footpath. Why not, she thinks. She won't sit outside in the melting frost, though. She pops inside after the girls, and the bell tinkles behind her. Nell died in 1970, leaving my grandfather in residence at the old villa for another dozen years, overlapping with their daughter, my aunt, one of the twins. The house is empty now, a palimpsest of family history, paraphernalia, photos and documents, much of which I've discovered only in recent months. None of what I've found, though, has contradicted my portrait of Nell. For me, as for her daughters, she remains intact, generous, courageous, possessing and dispensing kindness and exceptionally good sense, which I read as wisdom. Thank you, and happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Also, I thought it was really interesting that you read narrative, because we don't usually have people here that read from their book, and I thought that really helped it so much, and I thought that was excellent. Why did you, so you did it sort of like repurposing it, so you did fiction and realism, or was it mainly realism?
Well, I think when my twin aunts began changing the anecdotes that I'd grown up with and how they turned out, I thought, well, probably I can do that and stick to my guns with some of the earlier versions that I heard. I'm not an historian. I didn't want to spend ages pouring through history books and make sure that I had every fact right. Although, it's curious that, well, I do rely on my impressions and a sort of intuitive sense of what I want to write. And of course, because she died when I was 13, I didn't have many memories even to draw on. But I have been close to my aunts, and of course I had my father, so I guess fiction seemed to suit better. What I was trying to do was to build a sense of her as a person, rather than somebody who did this then, or just she left very little written evidence of her life. She wasn't a great letter writer. She didn't write diaries in her old desk, and it's possible she's thrown things out because other members of the family write extensively. It's possible she threw things out, but really I'm just finding, instructions for bridge or the rules of croquet, many pads of fine writing paper, which obviously remained unused to a large extent. And family photos and important documents.
Thank you. It probably makes it easier to read than a history book which has every fact perfect and fact checked, because I like reading these type of novels now, and I've read a few lately and it's helped my history no end. Now, any other questions? Oh, there's one over there.
How long did it take you, sort of from your inception and ideas to completion? And also I'm thinking my sister-in-law told me recently she's writing the history of her side of the family, because she wants all her sons to, she's done a lot of, she's the CEO of genealogy in her family, and she wants them to know about her family before she pops off.
Well, I really began to write, I say in earnest, but I didn't really have a lot of writing time. Around the time of the pandemic, when I became more involved with my aunts and what became their support and care. It wasn't a very conscious process, but I'm aware now that it seemed like a very good time to start finding, hearing their stories while they were still somewhat intact, and finding out what the legacy was really from their mother, because they would, even now, will still refer to her as though she is the one who has taught them how to live or how to access wisdom and good sense in their lives. So that doesn't answer that question at all. I began around the time, pandemic 2020, and here we are, the book was published this year. So I guess 3 years of writing scenes here, there, filling in the gaps, as I said, and then submitting to a publisher, and that whole process, that's usually about a year from the time one submits to the time a book appears. So, I would say a 5-year process, pretty much, yeah. Mm.
Is that actually true of Nell?
It is. When we got together, the publisher and I, or their little team and I, we knew there needed to be mountains as a backdrop, and we worked with lines of washing and gardens of flowers. I mean, these are other elements that I haven't alluded to, but she was a great flower gardener, apparently. And then at some point I came across boxes or albums of these quite formal photos that had been taken of, largely of Nell, and some of her brother in his soldier uniform. So she must have been about 15 or 16 then. And I just think seeing that direct gaze, which is also slightly enigmatic, we knew that she had to be there. So yes, that is Nell.
You said you wrote a little cameo for every year of her life. Was that a conscious effort, or did it sort of work out?
Initially, not at all. I just wanted to sort of an overview of her life, and then it was quite late in the process that I realised that I had most years covered, and there are a few I could fill in, and I think there might be one that I haven't. But having finished the book, other particular or potential scenes keep occurring to me. So if it's ever reprinted, it may be a tiny bit fatter than it is. I don't know, but I think it's a curious process, because I would just, for example, imagine Nell at the table with her father, and this scene kind of would come to me. So there is something very mysterious about the writing process. I knew of the betrayal about the sale of the farm, which is something my aunts later denied, but my mother, who still has her wits a little more about her, insisted that it was the case, that her money had bought the farm and that his impetus had sold it. So, yeah, but the details, I guess I've absorbed them from photos, from stories, from my knowledge of particular landscapes. Yeah.
Any final questions?
No, I'm just wondering, what were key insights that you have now looking back into the writing process, but also into the family?
Into the writing process. Well, I think I've enjoyed being able to write episodically. That's something kind of new, because I've tended to write fiction in the past, which was a long narrative where everything's got to kind of flow together. But doing this in a series of cameos, as it were, has been really satisfying, and also worked with the fact that I've been a little distracted in the last few years from much writing, and I didn't have long undisturbed stints to spend at it. And yet, even though I could say it's cameo, the theme is my mother's life and her sensibility, and by necessity my own sensibility. So I think, that is thematically it holds together as a necklace, as it were. And about the family, yeah.
Like, could you see particular traits come down through the line?
Yes, I think I am probably a little more like, well, I'm grateful for some qualities in Nell that I observe in myself, and I have a few rough ones that I don't know where they came from, probably from Herb. Yeah, it was lovely to sort of imagine the family dynamics. The oldest one, Colin, who's there in the puffer jacket and the one who climbed, he was kind of the golden boy. He was multi-talented, loved by many. He was involved in many clubs and societies, and very capable. And so I think he overshadowed the other members of the family. He was pretty forceful, opinionated character, not unlike my grandfather, whereas my father was quiet, thoughtful, really introverted, I think you'd have to say, and refused, because of his father's forcefulness, as he said, to foist his opinions on anybody, which has its own. For the children, it's not always helpful to have a father who won't make up his mind about anything. Yeah, and then the second daughter was, my aunt was actually a very strong woman, probably the most like Nell in the way that she lived, because she married a farmer too and went off and lived in some fairly, well, for a while they lived at Mount Albert Station across the river at Makarora, without road access, and raised 4 very strong girls. And then there were the twins, who were, it could be said, 2 afterthoughts, but I don't think she knew. Well, certainly the doctor didn't know that she was having twins until it happened. I think she had a suggestion of it, and their own lovely selves. And as I say, they have referred to Nell often for guidance. Often, yeah. Something else occurred to me then, but I may have lost it. If anyone wants to look, I've got some of Nell's, it's just a handful of, or 3 of Nell's, maybe 10 books of handy hints. And there's just hint after hint after hint, like, if you want to get wine stains out of the linen, you dip it in boiling milk and shake it about. And they're endless of these hints, and they're so meticulously and carefully, neatly written that I can only think that she must have done it before she married, or certainly before she had children, because it would have time to write them, let alone find and read them. They're not catalogued, not at all. So possible to find the hint you want at the time it's needed. And also one of her recipes books that will look familiar to any of you, I'm sure. There were all kinds of institutes that put out the recipe books, and then they got covers broken off, or the favourite ones got greased, and I've opened it there on the page with the crosses and all the grease.
Well, I'd like to thank Penelope. It's lovely to have Nell brought to life, and in such a dramatic way and in such an interesting way. So I'm sure a lot of us would like to read the book. So thank you very much.